Okay, so what was your
My first question was from the section 9. It was question number 15 about Orthodox Christianity in the Soviet Union. So I kind of wanted to know their characteristics, where it was centered, and how it was remembered.
So that was one that we kind of, I took out in terms of the slide where it says, what are the characteristics, where is it centered? Mm-hmm. I just need to know it's mostly in Russia and Eastern Europe. And the way I kind of explained, I said, try and imagine Catholicism, but with more ritual and without a pope. That was the kind of quick and dirty way of trying to explain what Orthodoxy is. There's a lot more to it. But in terms of what happens, in the place where communists took power, that was in Eastern Europe, like Poland, Romania, Hungary, of course, Russia, was typically, it wasn't really Protestant areas, it was Catholic and Orthodox. And so those were the people that felt the brunt of communism. And so there was a real attempt to basically actively destroy religion in the Soviet Union. A lot of priests and monks and nuns were executed, churches were taken over or destroyed, and so there were some difficulties there. And it was just, we watched a little video clip where people talked about those experiences, but then there was a priest at the end who said, but you see, we came back, right? We survived. So that's kind of the basic story there.
Okay. And do you go into detail about the experience of Catholics in North Korea?
No, I didn't. We kind of cut that because of time, but it was mostly just to understand that a similar thing happened wherever communism went, for the most part, was this attempt to destroy religion. North Korea was really good at it. And I just mentioned that North Korea, used to be called Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, used to be called the Jerusalem of the East.
Okay. Alrighty. So the next question, I kind of wanted... I was reading the bulletin points or whatever like that and everything, but I kind of wanted to elaborate on some of the characteristics of the United States before World War II.
Okay.
One of them being the point of the fears of secularization after World War II. Also the first one with the middle town, Munice, Indiana. I wanted to...
Muncie.
Oh, Muncie.
Muncie, yeah.
Okay, sorry.
So I'm from Indiana. So. I mean, basically, I just wanted to kind of highlight, people sometimes think back in history and think, well, people in the past were conservative, which is problematic, and then people in the past it was kind of static, it didn't change. And so people look at like how, there was this kind of, 50s, 60s, 70s into the 80s, the United States very, very religious. And one thing I wanted to highlight was that that's not always the case. This study on Middletown and Muncie, conducted in the 1920s and 30s, religion was becoming weaker in Muncie, Indiana. There were other associations that were replacing religion. The state was carrying out a lot of the things churches used to do, like poor relief. It used to be churches, but they can't handle it after the Great Depression. There's just too much. So the government steps in more and more. And then, we no longer in the United States have this kind of Protestant consensus. Now you have a lot of Catholics, you have a lot of Jewish people. And so there's a shift to, well, how do we unite Americans? Well, we do it through public school education, and it's not a religious identity. So there's increasing concerns among religious people that, wow, the United States is becoming more secular, right? We can think about the Scopes Monkey trial. That's kind of a sign where even though the fundamentalists technically win, they're discredited. They look terrible. And then what I wanted people to understand was what helps make America more religious is the fact that then we end up in this Cold War with communists who are avowedly anti-religious, and we want to differentiate ourselves from them. And figures like Billy Graham do that, right? They say, okay, yeah, we in the United States, we're religious, and we need to be religious if we're going to overcome the communists.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that leads into my next question.
Right.
I had more about Billy Graham, because I know the backdrop of him, because he's a really pivotal character in the United States and with the presidents. But I know the backdrop of him being an ordained Southern Baptist minister from North Carolina, and I'm guessing he's known for his revival meetings, his radio shows, and his television show. Did he have a television show?
I think so, yeah.
Television show, so I was I was trying to figure out what led him to the growth of support, and from online, I looked up, it said he did a series of revival meetings in LA in 1949.
Right.
And he was invited by the Christ of Greater Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And it was when he showed up on Stuart Hamblin's radio show. Was that what made him kind of...
Well, okay. So what we were kind of focusing on for this was just that he, things aren't going well for him in his revivalist career. But what leads to this kind of support for him is he fuses together this idea of Christianity being something that can help us defeat communism. There's this fear in the Cold War that, how can we compete with these governments that control people? How can we make sure that, how can we preserve freedom when we're dealing with this kind of power, right? When you have this very powerful country that can make people do what to do, how do we get people to use their freedom responsibly so we can compete with that kind of power? And Graham argues that Christianity can do that. Christianity can discipline people and make them enthusiastic so they'll be passionate so we can unite and overcome the communists. Who helps him then, and you mentioned a radio show, and that's correct, I think, what we focused on in class was William Randolph Hearst, the great newspaper magazine baron, and he's anti-communist, not particularly religious man, I don't believe, but he's very anti-communist. And he has these two famous words, puff Graham, meaning, make Graham big. And so this gives Graham, he's got this message, now he has a platform, and so this helps develop into this national anti-communist Christian, or what they would maybe call at the time period, Judeo-Christian culture.
So the message was about him, how we need to use evangelist belief to stop communism and to become a more spiritual nation, like he was trying to. Right, yeah,
it can unite Americans, and he's interesting because he was pretty friendly with Catholics, which was not typical and was controversial, but he was open to this in part because he wanted to build this kind of American consensus culture, and Catholics don't seem as dangerous when you're fighting against people who don't believe in any God, right? Well, it's like, well, those Catholics, at least, they believe in Jesus and so forth. We can work with them.
So that's part of like what you would describe the national culture he represents?
Yeah, right. It's this fusion of American culture, democracy, state, society, religion, all being united together to defeat communism.
Okay. All right. So I'll add on to that.
Mm-hmm.
So with Fulton Sheen.
Yeah, and I ended up cutting him.
Oh, you ended up
cutting him? I think I sent that out in either an email or I updated it. So you don't need no Fulton Sheen for the exam. Okay. I took him off.
Oh, wow.
Unfortunately, there just wasn't time. Fascinating man.
No. Yeah, he was pretty fascinating. Yeah. He kind of gives me a little Mr. Rogers little vibe for some reason. I don't know why. It's just the way he looks in this photograph.
Well, I mean, and he had this very wholesome image. Mm-hmm. It's funny because he had a successful TV show that was just him standing in front of a chalkboard talking. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really weird. And he always dressed up. He has his cape. He always was very well dressed. It was very interesting.
So did y'all talk about Dorothy Day?
We did, yeah.
Okay, so I know she, at the beginning, kind of used to live a bohemian lifestyle and everything. She was an American journalist, social activist.
That's right.
She worked for several socialist publications and newspaper staffs and everything before they kind of got shut down by the government.
Right.
And I'm guessing the Free Love was about her series of love affairs she had. And then she got married. Yeah, and later on when she started focusing on motherhood and stuff like that and everything, that's when she starts exploring with Catholicism and everything and trying to become a Catholic. Mm-hmm.
And the major thing I was trying to emphasize about her was I didn't want people to think that all American Christians bought into this kind of bellicose Cold War, we need to unite together to defeat the communists, right? That really kind of almost worship the American way of life. Right, this woman is fascinating because she dissents from that. She doesn't, and she's willing to argue with people. Like she clashes. Well, the example I gave in class was she clashes with Cardinal Spellman, who's this very powerful New York bishop, because he's willing to support violence to defeat communism. She says we shouldn't do that. We should be pacifists. On the other side, she will also clash with very liberal leaders in the Catholic Church. She has like a farm where that's kind of like a communal farm, and a liberal cardinal wanted to say Mass there, but he didn't want to do it wearing the proper clothing. And she told him, you have to wear the proper clothes if you're going to say Mass here. So it's just, I used her because she shows that not everyone was conforming to this ideal, and she fuses together this kind of very conservative Catholic morality with radical economic views and this radical pacifistic view, which is hard to fit into the Catholic tradition. Mm-hmm. So I liked her because she's just such an outlier. She says not everyone thought the same way. Yeah.
And I didn't know that she was being kind of considered to be canonized later on and everything.
Oh, right, yeah. There's a group of people that want to canonize her. It'd be interesting to see if that ever should go through. strangely enough, she would probably not care very much.
Yeah.
As an aside, like, I wonder if she would, because she was fast. She refused to get tax exempt status because she said, I don't want to be responsible to the government. She said, I'm not getting tax exempt status. So she, very curious woman, because she was in many ways she was anti-institutional, and she joined one of the most institutional religions you can join.
Yeah.
Right? You know, like, I don't like organized things. I'm going to become a Catholic.
Which made her fall out with a lot of her radical friends and everything.
Yeah, it's this weird thing.
But so do you go into how much detail do you go about the Catholic worker movement?
That was it, pretty much. Like I said, her major point is to show that not everyone agreed with Billy Graham and Fulton Sheen and the other staunchly anti-communist people.
Okay. All right. Make sure I don't have any more questions about that. All right. No. So then the last one was about Father James Keller.
Okay. Yeah.
I know that he was a Roman Catholic priest for the Maryknoll order.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he founded the Christophers, which is they're not really that organized in the sense of where they don't pay tithes. Like, I forgot what it says. Like,
it's just a voluntary group.
Yeah,
right?
it's a voluntary group.
I don't think you even had to be Catholic, right?
Yeah.
It's not. Mm-hmm. And it's this, in this feeling that you're being threatened by, in the Cold War, those denominational lines aren't as strong. So, like, for example, I included this. Jack Benny was Jewish, and he was supporting this movement. And several of these people are Protestant, some are Catholic. Like, they didn't care. It was a, and this is where you start. This is, I think, when Americans are more and more likely to say Judeo-Christian rather than simply a Christian identity, right? So
what problems did he feel that the United States was facing? Was it just communism or other things?
Well, and it's weird, he wouldn't say communism, but he basically, how like Americans now may say like the 1%, and they mean like the really wealthy people? He actually uses the phrase 1%, but he meant people, including communists, who want to radically transform the United States away from ideas of liberty, especially this idea, and he blends this together, this idea that, that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are based on this idea that we have God-given rights, that we have freedoms that have to be respected. And his point is there's people who are trying to tear that down. So we need Christophers. And Christopher literally, St. Christopher means literally Christ bearer. So we need people to go into society bringing Christ to society. And so he wants to create this kind of grassroots thing. He wants people who are just individuals to go out and do this. And so the example he gives, and this is why I used this between sections 9 and 10, was, and this is also key, I think, I would argue, and it'd be interesting what our American historians think of this. I think what really helps make the civil rights movement possible, and I should say successful, right? African Americans had long been striving for civil rights. What helped make it successful was the Cold War. And you can see the connection here because the other major social problem, he starts talking about how he wants to give an example of a Christopher, of just average everyday person making a change. And there's a African American who works at a gas station. He's just been hired. And these people go up to the owner of the gas station and said, as long as he's pumping gas, we will not come to this gas station. And this guy, he's a working student. He's got a family. This is really bad. And the gas station owner who hired him is like, I may have to fire this guy because if I don't fire him, I'm going to go out of business. So a housewife finds out about this, this homemaker, and she goes and talks to the guy and is like, well, what can we do about this? And he's like, and he said, well, I'm glad you're willing to help. And she says, what if I find you new customers? If I can find you new customers to replace the other guy, can you keep employing this man? And he said, yes. And she did. She actually got him more customers than he lost. And so that's the example. And that's why he uses this example, how anti-communism connects with the civil rights movement, because, Father Keller, he's nice. He's not, if you compare him with Billy Graham was Father Keller's kind of boring. If you listen to the guy talk, right, he's kind of boring. But he makes this connection. He's a very smart guy, and he makes this connection, that, I'm talking about freedom and human dignity. Well, geez, doesn't this violate human dignity? And, these God-given rights, these are being denied African Americans, so maybe we should do something about this. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of my argument. And that's why I use that as a transition point.
Well, that's good. That's really good. I never thought about that in their perspective, like how Cold War efforts in fighting communism could have been a catalyst for like the civil rights movement and helping their efforts as well, in order for it to take off as it did in the 60s.
Right. Yeah, so. Yeah, that's always the thing we have to think, why did it work now? Because African Americans had long been working for civil rights. Like what, and some of it's technological. It's because of TVs, right? You saw what, I mean, that goes with what Dr. King was trying to do is, you get this violence used to defend this terrible system televised. And then all these people are like, wow, this is really bad. This should totally be illegal. And then it works. It's just kind of weird.
Okay, so
sorry.
oh no, you're fine. So just that kind of leads into like Benjamin Mays and what exactly he did. So is really kind of what he did was that he picks not only the intellectual foundations of it, but is he kind of the one that helps tighten it up and become more organized and more of like a more national movement?
So I use Benjamin Mays for a couple reasons in this section. One of the major things was I just wanted to show that there was this local connection, because like it's weird how many people here don't know about him, and I'm like, I need to. It just would be weird, right, to do it without mentioning him, right? He needs to be mentioned, and the guy deserves a lot of credit. And he's this classic kind of, I mean, he starts off, like I say, he's the son of sharecroppers, former slaves, and then he manages to become not only a minister, but get a PhD, not in theology, but in religion, right? So it's a little bit different. And he becomes president of a university, and there he becomes the mentor of Benjamin Mays. And I included in the PowerPoint, this clip, this is a little bit, this is while King is active, but he's already writing stuff like this before King. And so it just shows how a lot of his ideas you can see in King. Like he has this massive influence. It's just neat, I think, that we have that kind of connection. But, and I just want people to see, this was the African American civil rights movement. It's not something that just African Americans start talking about in the 50s and 60s. They've been trying to get this for a long time. And the other thing was, of course, I don't think people realize like how bad the situation was and how widespread it was. And so that's why I have this clip of him talking about his experience of the movie The Birth of a Nation. And there's this terrible scene or series of scenes where it's supposed to, I mean, here's the image. It's supposed to be a black man, but it's a white guy in blackface. Yeah. And he sexually threatens this white woman. And Mays talks about how during, he's in a movie theater in Maine. So he's in the north. Yeah, so he went with his, so that's why I had looked up that. It was like he went to go see The Birth of a Nation in a local cinema during his college years, and he went with some white classmates, and he was really like shocked and appalled about how violent and kind of rodacious like his classmates, along with a lot of the white audience, got about some of the images they saw in the movie. And he ran, right? He and some of his African American classmates ran back. And what's interesting is they make it clear they weren't chased. They were afraid. And one thing I want people to understand, and I had that basic question, why was the civil rights movement hard? I mean, we look back and it's like, well, obviously this is what you should do. It's like, look at how this kind of atmosphere of fear that African Americans lived in. Like, that just at the, just going to the movie theater could suddenly become dangerous. Right? You get lynched just because some people are watching a movie and get upset. And, how do you then transform people who are in that environment where they're taught constantly to lay low, to avoid confrontation? How do you then get them to participate in Dr. King's movement and the movement of other leaders? That's very hard. How do you do that? And that was something King talks about in his letter from a Birmingham jail. And I thought that was just, there's so much to cover in class. I just thought that was an efficient way to make that point. Like you can't even go to the movie theater without being scared that someone's going to do something. And I also just wanted to stress, this is in the North, right? This isn't, this was a serious issue. This wasn't a Southern thing. This was a serious issue. Yeah, it really was, because I even also had looked up, too, about how there was a lot of protests, like, that even started in the North, like, for example, like Boston, and a lot of, like, the social advocates, black activists up there in Boston had protested outside the movie theater about it and everything, but how, like, a lot of Boston whites had actually went inside there and, like, they went to go see the movie anyway. Like, there were so many, like, Boston whites that had went to go see the movie. I just, just Boston itself and it being kind of, like, one of the pivotal places up there in the North, like, I just wouldn't have imagined, like, it having as much of a, I guess, take off that movie up there and everything. Yeah. I thought it would have been protests from both parties and everything like that. Right. Yeah, and then it gets really messed up too. Of course, the thing, technically speaking, like in terms of like the making of the movie, it's considered like so pivotal in film history. And then like, what's the first talkie? It's the jazz singer, which is really racist. And it's like, this is awful. Like, how do you do this? Like, it's
I
like
mean,
these.
I
It's
understand.
really weird.
As much as I really despise and like hate that movie or whatever, I
Right.
kind of do understand like them saying, because I looked up online and they said it was the first 12 real
Yeah.
film ever made and stuff. So I mean, I can give scholars slack when they acknowledge those
Oh, yeah, yeah.
cinematography efforts and everything like that and everything. But when they start just kind of appraising the movie, like even when I was reading the Wikipedia article about it, like it wasn't even kind of like, it's not like I'm telling them to jab at it, but it wasn't even like remarking about its prejudice, like
Right,
undertones and the KKK and its pro-Confederacy and stuff like that and everything. It just kind of just was being very straightforward, like it was, a 12-reel film, and it talks about, it was based off of this novel and
Right.
this novel and all this stuff, and I kind of was really kind of shocked about that, because I was just like,
The way Wikipedia is organized, hopefully I haven't looked at that particular entry. Usually they'll put that in like its own section. Like they want to keep the description as clinical.
yeah, I guess clinical.
And then later they're going to go into it and say, this is a lot of problems.
Yes, and
That's
then
my hope.
I read the receptions about it and the reviews, and like they're kind of focusing more on like people that appraised it. They talked
Goodness.
about a lot of people that appraised it
Oh, wow.
actually, and everything. Rather, like
Yeah.
he talked about like Theodore. It was Theodore Frasher or whatever. He was one of the advocates that actually like opposed it and said this was like blatantly out racist and
Right,
it was terrible. But it mostly talked about people that were like pro for it and like
my.
praised it, and like, there was one critic that had said something like awful. It was like, yeah, it's talking about how there's black monkeys and all this stuff and that and everything. I'm just like, what?
Yeah, no, it's ugh.
It's just
Yeah,
awful.
it's,
I just want to think that they would have went back and put more of like the terrible modern comments, like, which I'm sure like more of this modern social commentary would have been like, this is a terrible movie.
Right,
it's racist. Like
Yeah,
it's blatantly
yeah.
like prejudice and awful, So yeah,
Yeah,
I thought that was kind of
and
crazy.
it's mainstream at the time, and that's what's really disturbing. is
Yeah.
that this isn't like a fringe thing, but yeah. So yeah, any other questions?
So
or-
could you were elaborate? So how far did you elaborate about his? This was something Benjamin Ways wrote, or
Yeah,
was
I
it-
just wanted to highlight. You can see the parallels between his ideas and what you saw in the letter from the Birmingham jail. I mean, technically, this is before Birmingham jail, and you can see his influence, and you can also see he makes a statement about Islam and atheistic communism, and there again you can see this kind of idea that there's this competition for ideology, right? And King talks about that, like he says in the letter from the Birmingham jail, is like, if my movement fails, if nonviolence fails to change things, that means people are going to turn to violence, right? And you need to, you have to understand that's why this is so important that this succeeds. And he kind of alludes to those ideas. And again, it just connects the anti-communism struggle against the other as well, with civil rights.
So what is the Black Church? I see you have that underneath
Yeah,
Martin Luther King.
so-
Could you elaborate on that?
So again, that's there's no institution called the Black Church. It's just a kind of term used to recognize that for a long time, if the only thing African American communities could have as a kind of civic organization was a church, any other organization would have been crushed, right? Especially in areas that were segregated, but that was the one thing that you could allow. And so what happens then is that becomes not simply a religious edifice. It's a community center in a sense, right? That it connects to society, politics, all these things together, and it's that one space where African Americans can kind of have autonomy. And the idea is that there's this kind of, even among denominations, there's this coordination because of this kind of shared ethnicity or shared race, I guess I should say. And that's kind of what we mean there.
Okay. So the difficulties you're kind of elaborating was like when his house had got bombed.
Yeah.
Like someone threw a bomb in his house that time. I guess when he got locked up in jail for the Montgomery.
Right. Well, in the video clip, we were just focusing on Birmingham, but it was just this idea that he's facing. I wanted, again, people, when I say, this was hard, was, imagine someone is threatening your family, and I shouldn't say just threatening, carrying out threats against your family, and then you're going around saying, love them, right? And I think one thing, I think I mentioned this class, that one thing that was so striking was that one of King's aides said he was like this all the time. Like, he would not, use racial slurs against whites, even in private. And it's like, wow, you dealt with all these people talking to you about you and being, not just being rude to you, but trying to kill you, and you're still able to keep this love. that's what I wanted people to understand was that it to us this sounds so easy and like it makes sense today, and it's like, no, this was really hard. When he says love your enemies, it's like love enemies who are trying to kill you,
like
and your family.
In the Montgomery story, when they're talking about the Montgomery method, they talk about like how to keep the brotherly love and everything, even when like the whites are opposing you or not showing it back and everything. And they used the example of basically with one of these white guys like saying something terrible, a racial slur to one of the black people. And then they also talk about too, like after they had got the buses integrated and everything, how one bus driver had went and slapped a black woman and everything for doing it and stuff. And I'm just like, that would just be so hard now, because I just know so many kids now that just flip out about like losing their keys, their car keys or something like that and everything, something of that small kind of extremity. So to kind of put up with that and still have to
how do we stay disciplined when people are doing really awful things? It's not it's very difficult. I was hoping people could to gain an appreciation for that, because like maybe it's me, I just have this kind of feeling like Dr. King is used as like a talisman, like he's kind of trotted out as like, it's like
special,
it's shallow
kind of, oh well, really?
Or no, I mean it's like he's presented so in such a shallow way. I feel like it's just like, it's Martin Luther King Day, it's like it's like, no, you have to understand what this guy was trying to do was really hard. And I guess that's kind of my point. I don't know if it's appreciated enough the difficulties, and also what like this thing where I think people look back and think, well, if I was alive then I would have been on his side, and it's like, well, it would have been hard, right? It would have been hard
because a lot of people deviated so quickly and kind of went. Malcolm X actually had a lot of supporters or whatever, like that and everything, and because.
And King mentions that, right, in the Birmingham letter, right, that that this is,
he's dealing with those two opposing forces on the black side, and everything. So great. I just had like probably two more questions real fast. So one of them was like about from section 9. So can you elaborate a little bit more about how Nazi Germany and Christianity itself was a complex situation, like the relationship between those?
Sure. Well, I mean, you had people who. You had Christians who actively resisted, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, right? He was executed because he was part of a plot to kill Hitler. I mean, that's some resistance. But then you have also people like the so-called positive Christians or German Christians, and that's an actual denomination. I mean, it's German Christians. Yeah, it's. I don't mean like Christians who are German. I mean, there's an actual church called German Christians, and though they wanted to change Christianity to make it fit Nazi ideology. Right, so you had them doing things like saying Jesus was not a Jew, he was actually Aryan, which is kind of and they throw out the Old Testament, which is kind of shocking, right? But they're totally willing to rewrite Christianity to make it fit Nazism. So you have some Christians actively resist, some Christians do go along with it. We talked about Heinrich Himmler, though, because I wanted people to understand that Christians were under pressure, because some Nazis, not all, but some Nazis thought Christianity was terrible and was dangerous to Germans and should be replaced by the old paganism. And I guess he's not, of course, in Germany, but Pius XII, the Pope, has to deal with this problem, right? What should he do? He's supposed to be neutral, and he gives this kind of criticism in his Christmas address, which in some ways is vague, right? People criticize him because it's not explicit. He never says, Germans are persecuting Jews, right? He never says that. But at the same time, it still made the Germans mad. And so I kind of use him to just show how complex this is. Because even though I think the guy's heart was in the right place, you could still critique how he dealt with the situation.
Yeah. And so what words do we technically have to use carefully? Because when I was looking back at the notes,
I mean, hard. It was more of just like when people say Christian or church, well, we have to be very careful what we mean. Or well, they'll say like, well, that's against Christianity, and as a historian of Christianity, I'm like, well, which kind of Christianity is it against?
Okay.
And when some people will use like, so for example, when Catholics say the church, they typically mean the Catholic Church. But a lot of times when Protestants use that term, they mean like the invisible body of Christ, which is invisible, like you don't know what part it is. And you can talk historically about the church, meaning the Catholic Church, because like that's an institution that you could say that's that's the Catholic bishop doing something, those are Catholic priests doing something. But if you say the church in the sense of the mystical, invisible body of Christ, you can't really talk about that historically because it's invisible. Only God knows who's part of that church, so it's tricky. So I just wanted people to be wary and be careful And I said, during that section, I was like, I didn't want to confuse people, but if I wasn't afraid of causing confusion, I would call this class World Christianities.
Yeah.
Because I really want to highlight that diversity.
Yeah, because of the denominations that derive from
Yeah.
Christ. Yeah.
I mean, you have Christians who think war is okay. You have Christians who think war is absolutely wrong. And then you have people like Desmond Doss, who will go to war, but only in a non-combat. That's diversity. Yeah.
I think there's one more. Okay, I know that was. Okay. Yeah, so everything's fine for that one. Check real fast. Thought and church food. So, what we're kind of... No, I think I understand that by William Seymour about him starting. So, like, do we kind of need to know what church he started out there in LA or whatever?
Just that it was Pentecostal.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just key to know that he's part of the Pentecostal movement, and that he's, he believes in this kind of racial integration. That was something particularly important, I think, about the Pentecostals.
Okay. Okay. Can you elaborate a little bit about the doctrine of Immaculate Conception? Like,
Right.
So, okay, with the church doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, were they basically vouching that only the Virgin Mary was given that spiritual gift of being absent from original sin? But when I'm kind of confused on Bernadette's discovery. So was she discovering that some other woman or angelic figure that wasn't Mary was announcing herself to be the Immaculate Conception? She also, too, was given that gift of being absent from original sin.
Right. Well, it's theologically, Adam and Eve also didn't have original sin, so it wasn't, and they didn't think Jesus. Of course, Jesus wouldn't have it either. The idea was that Catholics believe that Mary was preserved from the stain of original sin from the moment of her conception. That's why it's called the Immaculate Conception. In order to prepare her to give birth to Jesus. That's the Catholic doctrine. And what happened? So it's important, of course, to know that. What I was really trying to emphasize was that, during this time when Christianity's under challenge in France, right, Catholicism's under threat, Catholics believed that this young shepherd girl, or I'm sorry, she wasn't a shepherd, I'm confusing that, Fatima, but this poor young girl who was relatively ignorant and uneducated, sees this woman, and the woman, all these other people say it's clearly Mary, and generally that's who it's understood to be, but she insists, well, I just saw a woman. And there's this idea that shows her humility. And then when she asks the woman her name, she says, my name is the Immaculate Conception. So that's why it's called like the Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception, or Our Lady of Lourdes. But a big part of this was that there was this belief that in this time of challenge to Christianity, God was intervening actively and showing believers, I'm still with you, don't worry about this stuff. And so I kind of relate it to Amy Semple McPherson, because there's this idea, Pentecostals had this experience with a God that says that God is here in this world. Maybe I can't understand evolution, how it works with Genesis. I'll ask God later, right? Because I had this experience, I can believe this. It's similar for Catholics here. So, this God intervened, this woman saw this, and she's such a humble woman, so how can I not believe this, right? You would be, and that's part of the whole reason why she just says, well, it was just a woman who called herself the Immaculate Conception. But also, of course, then they set up the medical bureau. Right.
So what was that actually testing out was? Because I guess, I'm confused on, did another miracle happen, or where she said she could go? Did she have a vision of where she said that people could be healed if they could go to this certain river?
Yeah. Bernadette Subaru, the young woman, was told, or says she was told by the lady that there was a spring that would heal people who were ill, and people would wash themselves in the water and then would later say they got better. So the Catholic Church set up a medical bureau staffed by doctors to test to see, were these people really sick? And they required that people bring medical records with them, and then they would take to the waters, and if they got better, they would have to be investigated by the doctors umpteen million times. I think now they claim about a dozen cures have been authenticated that they can't figure out any. I'm trying to remember the exact phrase they use, but basically they don't say God did this, but they would say there's no natural explanation for this, and so you could, if you want, think it's a miracle. The Catholic Church, I won't go into it, they have some strict rules about how they do those things. But the key thing was this idea of using science to try and affirm God's existence. How do we know God exists? Because this person was miraculously cured. How do we know it's a miracle? Because medical science says that it could not have happened otherwise. That's the logic. So does that kind of make sense?
Yeah,
it's this idea of God's direct intervention.
Yeah. That makes a lot more sense. You know, I'm still kind of a little bit confused. I'm like, how now the Immaculate Conception is a tangible figure, per se?
That's kind of the weird thing, and that was the thing that bothered the priest. But it was eventually, it's complicated because the Catholic Church won't say that you have to believe it, but they say it's worthy of belief, meaning that they can't find a fraud. If you want to go ahead and believe it and you're a Catholic, you can go right on ahead. It's kind of curious how that's done.
Okay.
I was just looking. I have a whole book on Lourdes, but it's hidden somewhere in my bookcase.
So, just this last one. So, I've been teaching about the characteristics of Protestant Christianity in the 19th century in China. So you just need to know that kind of Catholicism was dying out. Protestant missionaries.
Well, it wasn't that it was dying out. They were surviving, but they were surviving.
Oh, okay.
But they weren't doing great.
Yeah, so they're not doing great within these outside countries they're missionarying at. So Protestant Christian missionaries are trying to come in, but however, the Qing dynasty has doesn't want them in. They want these Westerners out, particularly because of their past histories with the Opium Wars and everything.
That's right.
So after those wars were settled, they had treaties. Right, they renegotiated treaties that allowed more Westerners to be able to trade at ports. Well,
what happened, right, so, I didn't want to go too much into it because it gets really complicated, but basically the Westerners were only allowed to trade in one port before the Opium Wars. Afterwards, they weren't allowed to do any kind of legal missionary work. After the Opium Wars, there's, I believe, 5 ports are open, and they can legally do missionary work in those ports. And it's through one of those ports that's opened that Hong Shu Quan, the guy who leads the Taiping Rebellion, that's where he learns about Christianity, and it helps lead to the rebellion.
All right. And so with the characteristics of the rise of science in Europe and everything, you just want us to know about the medieval universities rising, how universities started during the medieval era in Europe and everything. And
right. Well, a big part of that was just understanding that, that out of this Christian belief that faith and reason can go together, you get these universities that help make science possible. But then later, of course, science will challenge, either directly challenge Christianity or simply it can offer an alternate explanation. And then people can choose, right? When Christianity is the only game in town, it's like, well, we got to accept this explanation. But now you can choose. And you can describe why things happen without saying anything about God.
Well, yeah. Last, what roles can you elaborate, just to make sure I got it kind of right in my head, the roles about Christianity played in the West? So is this talking about how, during the medieval era, the church was the center of, European thought because of the fact of the Roman Catholic Church, and how your social and your spiritual kind of, position and dignity was all kind of tied into one, because you had to be a Christian, basically, and go to the church. But now, the scientific revolution and Enlightenment period is offering free thought and allowing people to use science and everything, which they were using at first to prove the existence of God and trying to make these discoveries and stuff. But later on, you start to see it kind of stray away from that and everything once they're able to use logic and reason to prove the natural things and phenomena in the world, right? Well,
you're right. A big part, I just want to, Christianity goes from being the center of everything in Europe to being increasingly on the margins. And so how are Christians going to respond to that? Right? How do you deal with being pushed to the margin once you were at the center?
Well, yeah. And don't the Europeans, they actually the people that want to embrace science actually win out and everything, versus the people that want to oppose it and not let it be used?
It's very, and I focused, because of time, when I dealt with Europe, I focused more on politics and society. So I was looking at the French Revolution, a little bit with science because of Super Bernadette and the Lourdes medical cures. the politics and science, we focus mostly on the United States, because that's where you have this struggle about Darwinism and social Darwinism and all those things.
Okay. Alright. Well, I think that's everything.
Okay, excellent.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
No, you're fine.
Your time.
Well, I can...